Author Kris Hall, as we sit here in early August, how's President Trump doing?
Well, he's a president.
And?
Well, you know, I teach the Constitution as it was intended to be applied. And the presidents in America have operated outside the realm of their executive authority, constitutionally speaking, for decades. So to judge Trump, for me, is not to judge him against Obama or George W. Bush, but to use the Constitution as a standard. And sometimes he's good, sometimes not so much. And so that's how we view what goes on in Washington, D.C. Not based on political party, not based on personality, but based on the standard by which all Americans should hold their federal government, the Constitution.
Well, when you use that measuring stick, which presidents, in your view, have adhered to the Constitution, which haven't?
Oh, it's been a long time. It's been a very, very long time since we've had a president that was truly constitutional. You look at Article 2 of the Constitution, and that is the delegated authority for the executive branch. And when we look at that, we realize how little power the president has, especially autonomously, constitutionally speaking. I always show my students, you know, you look at the Constitution, Article 1 is the powers that are delegated to Congress. It's like this. Then you go to Article 2, delegated to the president. And then you go Article 3, delegated to the judiciary. And in America, we've gravitated more towards an all-consuming executive rather than an executive in service to the legislative. And what we have now in America is a bit of an aberration of what the president ought to be. And we think that the president is a leader of America. He is not the leader of America. He was never intended to be the leader of America. The president was intended to be an ambassador on behalf of the states in foreign affairs. And you can see that when you look at the powers that are delegated. The president is not the designator of war. He is not the controller of our troops unless, constitutionally speaking, there has been a formal declaration of war by Congress. So you asked me which presidents, right? So we look, when was the last time we had a declaration of war by Congress? World War II. It means every military action that has been led by an executive since World War II has been unconstitutionally done so. And so we have a president is not allowed to make deals. He can only make treaties. Those treaties are only accepted as if they are confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate and are consistent, as Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution demands, with the delegated authority of the executive or legislative branches. And so what we have then is this expansion of presidential power, which is contrary to the intent of the framers. Our framers made the president a very small position relative to the legislative on purpose. Alexander Hamilton wrote a paper we call Federalist Paper 69. There was a great deal of discussion about the office of the executive. The designers of our constitutional republic were concerned that they had just achieved an independence from a monarchy. They did not want to establish a new government and create a new monarchy. I mean, it was an option. I don't know how many people remember from their civics classes, but there was a point in time where people were actually begging George Washington to be king. So we were this close to being the Kingdom of America. But our founders said, you know, we don't want to go back to the kingdom system again. Let's do the constitutional republic. But how do we ensure that the executive does not transmute over time into a king? And so the Federalist Paper 69 is a great source and understanding of not only what the power of the executive branch is, but why it's so very limited.
How did we get to the point then of executive orders and no war declaration since World War II? Is it Congress's fault?
Ultimately, it rests on the people. Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, "But on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders." And what we've seen in America is a decline in the importance of the study of the proper role and placement of the federal government, and human nature dictates that people will gravitate towards a more powerful government to take care of their needs and to provide them with more comfort, and government will always accept more and more power. So Congress, yes, has a great deal of responsibility in the expansion of the power of the executive branch by unlawfully and unconstitutionally delegating authority to the president through legislative acts. We have the people, though. A good example, the last presidential election. If I have a radio show and a television show, and what I did was I took 6 presidential candidates that spanned all, the parties. We had the Green Party, we had independents, we had Republicans, Democrats, Libertarian. And so what I did was I took their published platforms and I didn't compare them with each other, as is popular. What I did was I compared each of their platforms individually to the constitutional role of the president. And what I found was that the promises that the presidential candidates were making are promises outside of the authority of the office of the executive. So the president does not have the authority to raise or lower taxes. That is a power reserved to the House of Representatives. The president cannot take care of our troops financially. He cannot expand troops. He cannot withdraw troops. That is the office, or that is a power reserved to the legislative branch. And what I realized is that all of the promises the presidents were making were responses to questions asked by the people. Will you do this for us? I mean, that's what the whole website thing is. Yes, we will do this for you. I will do this. I'm making this promise. But I think if the people were better educated, better understanding of the proper role of the executive, we would ask better questions that are in tune with the delegated authorities of the president. So in that vein, I think presidents become who the people want them to be.
From your most recent book, Sovereign Duty, you write, and if you'll explain this, the central government as a creation of the Constitution is not and cannot be a party to the Constitution. Let me say that again so that you don't miss it. The central government is not a party to the contract. It is a creation of the contract.
One thing that we need to remember about the formation of the federal government, and in the Sovereign Duty book and in the class that I teach on state sovereignty that you covered here on C-SPAN, we go through a whole timeline. The states are the first creation of the people, and that happened on July 2nd, 1776, with the ratification of the Lee Resolution. From the creation of the states through the authority of the people, the states came together and said, we need to form a confederation of states. We need to form a union for our mutual protection from foreign invaders. And we must form this union to be a unified voice in foreign affairs for treaties and commerce and peace and war and those kind of things. And we need to form an alliance between the states for a more peaceful interaction between the states. The states were formed as independent sovereign governments. When you read the writings of the designers of our constitutional republic through the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, the ratification notes that James Madison took for the ratification debates, you see the terms state and nation played interchangeably. So when we speak of the state of Virginia, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, they also refer to Germany, France, and Spain as states as well. And so what we have to really understand is we created 13, at that time, independent sovereign governments with the same authority and political function as Germany, France, or Spain. And so they said, we need to come together and make this unified voice because we've looked through history, we've looked how Europe works, we need to fix the things that are not right over there. And through that, we will create a constitutional republic, bringing a confederation of the states, and then the Constitution itself will create the federal government. So the federal government did not exist until the Constitution was ratified. Not only that, there was a precarious moment prior to the ratification of our current Constitution where we didn't have enough states to ratify. It was a pretty scary moment for those who were designing the Constitution to think we might just not even have a union at all. And if that were to happen and the Constitution were not ratified, then there would be no federal government. So what we also have to realize is that the Constitution is a contract. Now, contract law speaking, when you have a contract, you have the parties to the contract. The parties of the contract are the people who come together to make the terms of the contract, they negotiate the terms, they design the contract, and ultimately sign the contract into legal being. In our constitutional republic, the states are the parties to that contract. There are some who teach that the Constitution is an agreement between the people and the federal government. That is not true. It can't be true. And we can show that to be false by one simple fact. How was the Constitution ratified? Was it ratified by popular vote? No. It was ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the states, being the ratifiers of the Constitution, mean that they are the parties. Some also try to teach that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government. That is a temporal impossibility because the federal government did not exist until the Constitution was ratified. You cannot be the party to a contract when you are the product of the contract, because you cannot sign the contract into legal being until the contract, if you don't exist until the contract is already signed. So the only parties that existed that could be the creators of the Constitution are the states. And the federal government did not exist until the Constitution was ratified, which makes them the product. So the states are the creators of the Constitution. The Constitution created the federal government. Therefore, the states are the creators of the federal government.
So July 2nd, 1776 to what? September 1783?
1787.
87, when the Constitution was finally ratified.
Well, we had the Articles of Confederation in between there, but they proved to be faulty on several aspects. When you read the notes to the ratification debates and the correspondences that they had with each other, you learn that the greatest difficulty, the greatest problem that they had with the original Articles of Confederation was that the federal government was operating outside of its boundaries, and it didn't have enough direction. So the greatest problem that we were having at that time was that the federal government was making inequitable treaties. So what they were doing was they were making treaties with foreign governments in which one state or one set of states had to provide all of the resources, and then a separate state or a separate set of states got all the benefit. So the states, having just now formed this union with this understanding that it's supposed to be mutually beneficial, who are having to foot the entire bill, were like, wait a minute, this is not why we signed up for this, to transfer our wealth to another state. So we are not going to comply with this treaty, which is a really big deal, because not only is a treaty an agreement, it's a contract with a foreign government. So our states who were refusing to comply with these foreign treaties, and they were righteously resisting because the treaties were inequitable for the members of the states, were making the foreign government mad for breaking the terms of the contract, plus the states that were supposed to get the benefit were mad at the states who wouldn't pay. So we have a problem now in the Articles of Confederation. Our confederation's about to split, and we just got started because we're about to go to war between the states on conflict. We're about to go to war with foreign governments, which is why we brought together the new convention to create our Constitution, which is why our new Constitution is called the More Perfect Union. So when we dissolve the Articles of Confederation, there is no more federal government. And the only governments that exist are the states. And there would have never been a new federal government had not our current Constitution been ratified.
From your book, Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution, which was published in 2011, you write, "A common refrain these days is that we fell asleep. What that means is that our ignorance of the history that brought us our American liberty allowed tyranny to sneak up on us. However, that was not the case for our founders."
When we take the big picture, and I mean the full scope of the history of our American constitutional republic, we have to realize that it didn't begin in 1787, that liberty was not invented in 1776, and tyranny was not invented by George III. And when I teach a class called The Genealogy of the Constitution, which is covered in the Not a Living, Breathing Document book, what we do is we take the 700 years of history that give us our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. And it is this history that proves to us that our Constitution is built upon time-tested principles, axiomatic truths. They are not inventions. Because when you know that history, you know there are 5 documents that were written. They are called the British Liberty Charters. And within those 5 documents, you find every single aspect of our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. Not even just in principle, sometimes in the very language themselves, just taken from those documents and supplanted. We didn't invent anything in our foundational documents. We inherited everything. And it is that history that proves to us that our founders actually, and this is what may surprise some people, which surprises everybody who attends this class or reads that book, is that there is nothing new in America. This is not a brave new world. There's a popular belief that the Constitution is irrelevant, inapplicable to today because, our founders couldn't know what we're possibly seeing today. But when you study that history, you see that we are just repeating the same scenarios over and over again throughout time, even today. The same stories. It's the same people with the same interaction of government, just different faces and better technology. History always repeats. And I think the theme of the Not a Living, Breathing Document book is that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes.
Kris Ann Hall, you've mentioned these classes that you teach. Where do you teach them?
I teach all over the country. We teach, this is year number 7 for us.
Who's us?
My husband. Well, it's a family endeavor. So there's 3 of us, my husband, JC, and our son, Colton, who has been traveling with us and teaching for, 7 years now. He is 11, so he is quite the traveled young man. He's been to almost every state in the Union, to include Alaska, but not Hawaii yet. He's praying for that one. And he's been to 4 countries. And so what I do is I travel around. We teach on average over 260 classes every year in over 22 states. And we don't solicit for classes. People email us and contact us and say, come and teach us. I teach high school, middle school students, college students. We teach civics groups, business groups, bar associations, law enforcement. I've taught the legislators of 10 states from the sovereign duty class. We will teach anybody. And what people find when we teach these classes is that some preconceived fallacies have to fall away. Teaching the Constitution doesn't label me in any certain group. And what people find is that it doesn't matter on what political side you stand. The Constitution is relevant to everyone. I taught a national conference of physicians and surgeons, and it was very exciting hearing their comments afterwards. You know, these are not people that would be, you would think, generally carrying around their pocket Constitution, you know, and they were so excited about what they learned. And I think that's what we find as we travel around and teach, is that this is an empowering message for all people, an inspirational message that overcomes a feeling of powerlessness that Americans have today in view of how their government operates.
Do you charge for these classes?
We have no speaking fees.
How do you pay for it?
It's
a lot of travel.
It is. No, we have airplane tickets, rental cars, food, hotels. We have never had a speaking fee. We've never required anybody to compensate us for our travel or our expenses. We do this as a mission of our heart. We are not independently wealthy. We have never received a grant from anyone, but we work solely off private donations, you know, 20, 30 bucks here and there, and the sale of the books. And we're not out to get rich. Our family is a family of missionaries. So when we're not teaching the Constitution in the United States, we are missionaries to Haiti. We have that servant's heart. And the best way I've heard somebody describe what we do here is we are missionaries to the people of the United States in defense of the Constitution. And that's how we operate. So we work solely by faith. And for 7 years, it works.
From your website and from your bio, I was raised a Democrat. The only thing more evil than Satan was a Republican in my home. I was an environmentalist, an ardent environmentalist. Some of my best friends were members of Greenpeace, and I supported the World Wildlife Fund and PETA. And I was a vegetarian by ideology, not for health reasons, for almost 15 years. I believed in global warming and defended it vigorously. I believed in the Big Bang and openly criticized those who believed in creationism as ignorant and misled. I supported abortion and often openly condemned others for being pro-life. I have argued with abortion protesters on street corners and called them names that I am not proud of. I was not only not a Christian, but I practiced many other religions, including many occult versions. I was bitter against God and felt that only ignorant, weak people needed faith. I was too intelligent and too educated for such a feeble crutch.
I've come a long way.
What happened?
You know, I didn't have an epiphany moment. It was a transformation process for me. And it began, even though, you know, you start with the beginning. In my household, there was nothing more evil than a Republican than Satan himself. It was a very politically active household. My parents, my father and his father and all his brothers are union people, and so our political ideology came from that, union born, union fed, and when we die we're union dead kind of thing, you know. And so there really was no other choice. And in that paradigm there was also a very, very strong work ethic. So if you want to be the right person you need to be somebody who's willing to work hard and put in the time and put in the effort. My dad is one of the hardest working people that I know. And he was able to instill that work ethic in me. So when it was time for me to go to college, I put myself through school, you know, student loans and jobs, and I worked really, really hard. I graduated with a degree in biochemistry, and I didn't graduate with any delusions of grandeur. I realized that I had to start off at the bottom and work up. And in doing so, I started noticing the paycheck, that there are these taxes coming out of my paycheck. Now, being raised, I was taught that paying taxes is your fair share, to take care of the elderly, to take care of the orphans, to take care of the disabled, the people who can't take care of themselves. But as I'm looking around and I'm noticing my community around me, I'm noticing that the same people who weren't working when I went to college are still not working. Not because they can't, but because they choose and make choices not to. And I didn't think that's the definition of fair, because if taxes were about fairness, then the people who work hard, who have sacrificed to put themselves in a better place, would have to pay less taxes. And so I started thinking about that. I don't have any problem with charity. I have a problem with government telling me I have to be charitable and to whom I have to be charitable to. And so I'm no problem, socially speaking, with taking care of the orphans and the widows and the disabled. I think that the people of a community to do that. But I don't believe that's the role of government, to take from me and give to whomever they choose, and that's not fair. Then when I had a family, I began to realize that it's not the government wiping noses and cleaning up sick and the late nights. It's not the government who's administering the discipline, and it's not the government that is really ultimately concerned on what kind of person my child would become. That's a responsibility that falls on me and my husband. So it doesn't take a village to raise a child. It takes a family. And when I looked around in the evidence in my communities, the children that were being raised by the government in these systems were not children who were respectful, who were, as a whole, not respectful of their surroundings and respectful of what they had and of the community. You have the individuals, right? But for the most part, they didn't have the values that my family wanted to have. So I realized it's our responsibility. And then when I gave my life to Christ, you see, my whole life was I'm a seeker of knowledge. That's just who I am. And I always felt an emptiness inside of me. And so I tried to fill it with lots of stuff. Like I said, I've practiced all kinds of religions to fill that kind of emptiness in me. And it wasn't until I had a meeting, a spiritual meeting with Christ, that I realized that only He could fill that emptiness. And in learning in that, I realized, finally, the proper role of government in the lives of the people. And so it's been a long process for me. And in that process, I've come to understand that a lot of the things that I held to be truth and wisdom were just as much faith as the faith that I have, and maybe even less faith than I have in, more faith to believe in those things than I do to believe in God now.
Biochemistry undergrad at Blackburn College, which is where?
Carlinville, Illinois.
JD from the University of Florida. How did those two connect?
With a long period in the middle, actually. I joined the military in between there, and I was a Russian linguist in the U.S. Army. And when I was in the military, I broke my hip. So I had to, I was medically discharged for a service-connected injury, and I had to have a total hip replacement. So I have a hip that's 16 years old this May. And when I graduated, or when I got out of the military, where I met my husband, we moved back to his hometown. And the opportunities to be a biochemist in the little rural area that we were living in were very few and far between. I had to drive commute over an hour. And that's not like commuting in DC where you sit in traffic for an hour. I mean, you're really driving for an hour. And it just became very, very hard to keep up that. And I really didn't feel like that was what I wanted to do anymore. So to fill in the spaces, because I'm not a person who sits still well. I don't just sit, so I can't stay at home and do nothing. I had to go out and find a job. I started working for a local attorney as a receptionist, secretary, just for something to do. And I noticed that I was doing a lot of his legal writing. And I was thinking, man, I'm doing all this work. He's collecting a paycheck. This is something I could probably do. And I discussed it with my husband. I was 31 at the time. And I was really sort of intimidated to go back to school at that time. And I said to my husband, I said, is this something, this is going to be a huge sacrifice for the family. We're going to have, once again, college debt. I'm not going to be able to work full time. I'm going to have to be away from home. And my husband has always been so supported. His favorite saying is, hey, we'll do it or we'll die trying. We're going to give it a shot. I talked to my mom about it, and I said, Mom, I don't know. I'm so old now. Why would I go back to school? She says, how long does it take to go to law school? I said, 3 years. She said, well, in 3 years, you'll be 3 years older anyway. Why not fill it with law school anyway? And so I did. And it was through the encouragement of a friend of ours who was actually a childhood mentor for my son. He was chief assistant state attorney in our community. His name's Tom Coleman. He also taught my husband karate his teenage years. And I sat down and I talked to him about this, and it was his encouragement finally that gave me the confidence to go. And when I went to law school, I knew what I wanted to do right then and there. I was going to be a prosecutor. I was going to work for Tom, be the guy who wears the white hat and fights the bad guys. And I never had a job interview while I was in college, in law school. I never had any ambition to go work for the big law firms. I knew where I was going, I knew what I needed to do, and so we got it done. I was actually given special permission by the Florida Bar Association and the University of Florida to become a certified legal intern to work for our state attorney's office before any of my classmates, because we're a small rural community, and our state attorney, his name is Jerry Blair. He was the attorney then, he's retired now, wrote a letter to UF saying, we could really use her help. And I actually had tried over 10 jury trials before I even had my bar license. And it was such an amazing experience for me. And I think that's much to the chagrin of my husband, where my brain started changing. I had a very influential professor. His name is Joseph Little. I think he's retired now too. But he was my constitutional law teacher, and which is done in the first semester of law school at UF. And he said to us, we're not here to teach you the law. That's impossible. We're here to teach you how to think like lawyers. And then it snapped for me. I don't need to memorize all this stuff that I can look up in the books. I need to learn how to think, how to make this happen. And it was the skills of being a linguist and learning document translation and learning to think like a lawyer that made understanding the documents that the designers of our constitutional republic wrote and learning how to apply them to the Constitution as it's supposed to operate.
Before we go any farther, let's get our viewers involved. This is
great.
Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and this is our monthly in-depth program where we invite one author to come on and talk about his or her books and their lives. This month, it's author, activist, constitutional activist, Kris Hall. She began publishing books in 2011. Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution came out that year. Bedtime Stories for Budding Patriots also came out. Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America came out the next year. Essential Stories for Junior Patriots came out in 2013. Her most recent book is Sovereign Duty, which came out in 2014. And there's a new children's book out as well.
There's two, actually.
Yes, and I've got too much going on here at the table. We'll get to those in a minute. But we want to invite you to participate in our program this afternoon. 202 is the area code if you'd like to dial in and talk with Kris Hall. 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones. 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, if you can't get through on the phone line, still like to make a comment, we have some social media ways of getting a hold of us, and that includes Twitter. At BookTV, you can leave a comment there, or you can join our Facebook page at facebook.com/BookTV. You'll see Kris Hall right at the top there, and you can make a comment underneath that. And you can email us as well at booktv@cspan.org. We'll begin taking your calls in just a few minutes. How did you get into the publishing world? How did you decide that you wanted to write a book?
You know, that's a really great question because I can't even remember actually sitting down and thinking, wow, let's write a book. You know, when I look back over the last 7 years, it all seems a bit surreal to me because this is not the path that I chose. You know, it feels like a path that was chosen for me, that we simply said, yes, we'll do this. And so, you know, it's funny, I think that I would ask my husband if he remembers, but I saw a need. I think one of the things that I do, I mean, I think every individual has a gift, a unique gift in what they do. And one of the things that I do is I connect dots. I am a dot connector. I am able to look at a picture and see how it comes together and then able to explain that in a way that people understand. And in studying the Constitution, not just simply what I learned in law school, because I learned as I started studying that we don't teach the Constitution in law schools. What we teach is constitutional law, which has unfortunately become very different from the Constitution. Our constitutional law classes teach that our judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it, and that after all, it was written over 200 years ago, so it can't possibly be relevant today. And so when I started reading what the designers of our Constitution wrote and the history that built it, I realized that that errant understanding of our Constitution stems from an ignorance of that history and a lack of vision of all these dot connectors. And it's where we get this idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. And there's different sort of meanings of that. So when I say that, I mean there are the people who believe that the Constitution is amendable by Supreme Court opinion or by legislative act or by the need of the modern times. Obviously, the Constitution can be amended through Article 5 Convention under very strict terms. But there's a group of people in America who believe that the Constitution is not a contract and it's not a set of standards, but a sort of guideline for the government that we try to follow. But I realized that that understanding only comes when you extract the history and the foundation upon which our Constitution is built. And when I started connecting these dots and seeing how obvious all of this is, the axiomatic truths and the time-tested principles upon which our Constitution is based, and the ramifications of setting those aside are not unforeseen consequences. They're actually foretold warnings. And I thought, you know, we need to put this in writing in a way that other people can understand this as well.
Are you in favor of an Article 5 convention?
A lot of people ask that question, and it's a very interesting question because I think it's oversimplified today. There is no yes or no answer to that question. And again, when I teach, and I mean to throw your question back at you, but when I teach, you asked me, are you in favor of it? I don't teach my opinions. I don't think my opinions are necessarily relevant in the history and application of the Constitution. What I'm more concerned about is how an Article 5 convention is intended to operate. How did the designers of the contract envision this term in the contract to operate? And how will that operate in light of today's vision, errant vision at most, of how the Constitution is supposed to operate? And so the Sovereign Duty book has a whole chapter on that. I also did a week-long series on my radio show, the Kris the Kris Hall radio show. I also have a television show where I highlighted that as well, where we talk about the Article 5 convention, and I've written several articles on my website as well.
Well, from Sovereign Duty, you write, our framers anticipated the need to amend the Constitution as our awareness of liberty expanded and perhaps our need for government diminished. Listen to Thomas Jefferson's view on amending the Constitution. It appears clear that he felt it was needed, but not to be taken lightly. And this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. I am certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and Constitution. I think moderate imperfections had better be borne with because when once known, we accommodate ourselves to them and find practical means of correcting their ill effects. But I know also that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind.
Absolutely. And the quote actually continues to make an analogy that to force a man to wear the same coat as he wore as a child would be the same as forcing a society to wear the same constitution it wore at its inception. And the interesting...
that's not living, breathing necessarily?
No, it is not, because there is a contractual manner and a specific term under which the modification is to take place. It's not based on a whim, it's not based on modern trends, it's not based on who's ever in political power. You know, is it this party in power at this time, this party in power at this time, this ideology taking control, you know, that kind of thing. Article 5 says, this is how we do this, and this is the only way it can be done. You cannot modify the Constitution's terms by interpretation. The Constitution doesn't need to be interpreted. It's not written in Chinese. It needs application as a contract would be applied. And so Article 5 lays out those terms. And if we're going to have a convention in this modern day, James Madison was concerned about a future convention because he actually says that the only reason we're able to have this convention work today is because we've just come from a bloody revolution, and the horrors that we've seen are keeping the delegates' minds focused on liberty and keeping them from diverting to personal gain, political gain, avarice, and greed. He says, but I'm concerned about a convention in the future. Without such motivation, how would we keep those delegates on focus? And how would we keep those delegates from being the people who made the problem being tasked with correcting the problem? So when answering the question, should we have an Article 5 convention? The answer must be based on the application of Article 5 as it's intended. Why are we going to do this? What's our purpose? Are we going to have a convention so that we can expand the liberty of the people and limit the government even more? Because that was why. When you study the chief reasons for the incorporation of Article 5 and you know the history, every single time that our founders, before they became Americans, you know, they were British and they were in a kingdom. So every time they wanted to limit government and expand liberty, they had to pick up the sword and fight a king. They gave us Article 5 so that we could expand the liberty of the people and limit the government without picking up a Civil War sword. And so what we have to understand is the purpose of Article 5 is for an enlightened people who need less government, not a mechanism to control an out-of-control government.
Kris Ann Hall is our guest, and before we go any further, let's take some calls and hear your voices. Let's begin with Joan in Newport News, Virginia. Joan, you're on Book TV. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Excuse me, this is my favorite show that you have, and it's an honor to talk to your author there. And I wanted to ask her to please clarify the difference with the Supreme Court. For instance, Obamacare, immigration. There's so many of us just see common sense. In the books that I've read about the Constitution, they're not supposed to make the law. They're supposed to interpret the law. So you're very smart, so please tell me the difference between them not interpreting the Constitution and making the law themselves. And thank you for your time, and I'm enjoying you very much.
Thank you very much. That is a great question. When we're talking about the role of the federal government and the acts that they create, there are certain lines of questioning that must be answered. First, is the authority delegated to the federal government to exercise that power? And then second, are they exercising that power within the limitations of their delegated authority? With healthcare, there is no authorization, no delegation of authority to the federal government to exercise authority over healthcare. That is a power that is to be reserved to the states. James Madison, who has obtained the nickname the father of the Constitution, who is also the fourth president of our United States, wrote a document that we call Federalist 45, and he explains the delegation of power and the separation of power between the states and the federal government. He said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally on external objects, foreign affairs, and he names them: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. He continues and says the powers that are reserved to the states will include all of the powers: the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So what we need to understand is if it's not been delegated to the federal government, it has been reserved to the states. Healthcare is the lives of the people, the internal order and operation of the state, the property of the people, which means it is very distinctly a power that is reserved to the states. The Supreme Court does not have a delegated authority to expand what has the power that has been delegated to the federal government. They themselves are limited by the terms of the Constitution because the Supreme Court is a product of the Constitution itself. And our modern Supreme Court has jumped outside of its constitutional foundings. It has created in and of itself a power to determine the power of the federal government. And you know what's interesting is that our founders actually anticipated a court system to do that and made comments on why that's not appropriate. And so healthcare is not a power that has been delegated to the federal government. Therefore, it is not a power that the Supreme Court can grant or sanction for the federal government either. We have 3 branches within the federal government, 3 parts to the federal government: legislative, executive, and judiciary. The judiciary is part of the federal government. If we continue to allow part of the federal government to define the power of the whole of the federal government, then what we're actually saying is we have an arbitrary government that is not bound by a constitutional standard, whose only limitation of power is what it designs for itself. And if that is the case, then we must admit we no longer operate as a constitutional republic, but as a banana republic or a totalitarian kingdom.
And Kris Ann Hall writes in The Path to Restoring America that many times the constitutional law classes distort and destroy a proper understanding of the Constitution or shift its authority to courts and precedent.
That's right. And that's part of the unmooring of the Constitution. And you know what's interesting is when you study the history that built up through the Constitution, we're talking 700 years of government and a limited monarchy that was created by the Anglo-Saxon community all the way back in 1014. There is a trend of government in consuming more power and limiting the liberty of the people. And one of those, I had mentioned earlier in our history class that we teach, there's 5 documents that create the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and our Declaration of Independence. Well, the 4th document is a document called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. And the preamble of this document says, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design to subvert the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom." What they're really saying is, we have been watching government for about 600 years, and we're beginning to notice a pattern. And this pattern of activity by government, whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine our liberty, can be identified. And that pattern was the first step of government in taking liberty from the people and expanding the power of the government was always corruption of the court system. Because when you have a court system that is not bound by the terms of the law, but only bound by the ideologies of those in power, you can change the law without rewriting it. And there's something about human nature, people, the way we're hardwired, I don't know, we trust judges to be fair and impartial, as if they're superhuman. They're not influenced by political influence or personal gain or greed. Sometimes you put on a black robe and now you're a superhero and you're shielded from all of that. History says that's not true at all. And it is the court system who becomes tied, much like the church, tied to the government first and starts doing the bidding of the government contrary to the liberty of the people.
Next call for Kris Ann Hall comes from Mark in Santa Clara, Utah. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon. Hi, Kris Ann. I'm a former private high school civics class teacher and a big supporter of the truth you teach about the Constitution. My 2-part question, and somewhat relates to what you just talked about. Multiple studies reveal that between 80 and 90% of all present-day federal government activity, that which the federal government does, and federal expenditures as well, are unconstitutional, arguably criminal. Would you please tell us, what is the duty, according to Thomas Jefferson and other framers of our nation, of every state legislature in this country concerning nullifying any and all federal government activities, federal laws in the particular state which violate individual rights of the people? And the second part of the question, would you talk to us some about the unconstitutional nature of U.S. Supreme Court ruling Marbury versus Madison, arguably the most destructive Supreme Court decision in history, in which the court claimed the Constitution specifically gives the federal government the power to void any act it chooses of Congress, the executive branch, as well as state, county, and city laws? Thank you.
That is a fantastic question, and there's so much there, it's going to be hard to address it all. But I would like to simply say this is the whole reason, that the answer to that question is the whole reason why we wrote the book Sovereign Duty, and it's why I teach my state sovereignty class. James Madison wrote in the document we call Federalist 52 that there are 2 distinct spheres in government. the sphere of the state and the local and the sphere of the federal. And in understanding those two spheres of government, there is a separation of power there. He explained that separation of power in Federalist Paper 45. And what we have lost attachment to in America is the greatest check and balance on federal power. Thomas Jefferson explains in many of his writings that the greatest check and balance on federal power is not the federal government checking itself, but the check of the states on the federal government. Jefferson even says that if the states look on with apathy, on the gulf which is to swallow all, that term, the gulf which is to swallow all, is a euphemism for Washington, D.C. He says we will become colonies in a kingdom rather than independent sovereign governments in a constitutional republic. And that great check and balance is the authority of the state through the governor and the attorney general and the local representatives, through the authority of the sheriff in their promise, their oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, to say to the federal government, this power that you are exercising is outside the power we delegated to you through the Constitution. Remember, the federal government is the creation of the states. The states are the master of the federal government by the nature of its creation. And our framers, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Mason, all of these in our debates understood that it was the role and the duty of the state to control its creation by saying, we want to remind you, you have been delegated this power and this power alone. What you're trying to do is not a delegated power, therefore it is usurped from the states and the people. And since you are stealing this power from the states and the people, it is an unlawful exercise of power, which makes it null and void. Hamilton says this in Federalist 78. Jefferson says this quite a bit. Madison says that even the power of the judiciary cannot be above that of the states because it's the states that created the judiciary. And in that, the proper response by those who designed the constitutional republic, who designed the check and balance, the proper response to control the federal government is the states as individuals to say, this is an unlawful exercise of power being stolen from us, the states. Therefore, it is null and void to us, and we will not comply. And James Madison called it interposition. It is the role and the duty of the state to step in between an unlawful exercise of power by the federal government to the defense and the security of the liberties of the people. Jefferson explains how interposition works, called nullification. Nullification says that a power exercised by the federal government that is not authorized by the Constitution is an unlawful power, therefore it is null and void. Hamilton expressed it this way in Federalist 78. He said, no law contrary to the Constitution can be valid. And so it's simply the state stepping up and saying, as your creator, we have a responsibility to the people to secure their rights and their liberties. And we have to limit your power so that you don't become a kingdom again. And in limiting your power, we are going to reserve our power and limit your power within our states. So your unconstitutional authority is null and void within our states. We see that happening today in America. The states that have legalized marijuana within their states are nullifying federal law, righteously nullifying federal law. And what we need to realize is that there is no authority within the Constitution that delegates, there's no delegated authority in the Constitution to allow the federal government to regulate plants or anything that we consume, ingest, or inhale. That is a power that was created by the Supreme Court in a Supreme Court case about wheat. The Supreme Court said that because wheat could possibly be a matter of commerce, and we have this commerce clause, therefore it is a power of the federal government to regulate the control of wheat. And through that, they have this slippery slope of including everything in there. Now we include marijuana in there. The Supreme Court does not have the authority to expand the power of the federal government by opinion. That's what makes us a banana republic. A constitutional republic says even part, whether it be the executive, legislative, or judicial, no part of the federal government can expand the power of the federal government beyond the constitutional limitations. And so this is the ultimate check and balance. The state saying, you're not authorized to regulate our plants. So as sovereign states, we are going to operate based on the principles of the people of our state, and we will legalize this. And that's how nullification works.
Are you still practicing law?
I do not practice law. I have an inactive status, which means that I still have my bar number, but I don't take cases. When you're teaching 260 times every year in 22 states, I can't take a case in the courtroom. It would not be fair to my client. I could not dedicate that. And as much as I miss the courtroom, because I really do miss that, the trial. I mean, as a prosecutor, I had more trials than most lawyers will have in their entire career. I had more trials before my bar number than most law professors will ever see in their career. I do miss that courtroom, the debate and the advocacy, but I really, really feel a passionate need to do what we're doing now.
From your book, The Path to Restoring America, it says that Kris Ann Hall is an attorney and former prosecutor fired after teaching the Constitution to Tea Party groups. What happened?
Well, when I started learning about the Constitution and realizing the difference between how the courts operate and how the Constitution dictates they operate, and how the people see their government as opposed to how the government is supposed to operate, I felt something stir in me, you know, and maybe that's that inner natural fire that says, hey, this is not right. And so I started talking about it. And I got, we have a Supreme Court justice in Florida. His name is Fred Lewis. At the time, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I believe, and he's the reason why I wrote that book, Path to Restoring America. He took a poll of Floridians and asked this question without using any resources, without looking up on the computer. I mean, just off the top of your head, I want you to name all 5 liberties of the First Amendment. There are 5 liberties in the First Amendment alone. And he found out through that poll of Floridians that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. And that really disturbed me. Because here's the thing. If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? And how are you going to defend your liberty if you cannot even define it? And so Fred Lewis started this program in Florida called Justice Teaching, where lawyers and judges volunteer to go into the classrooms and teach on aspects of the First Amendment. And that's how I got started. I started teaching in the middle schools and the high schools about this First Amendment because it bothered me that, I mean, we're not talking about kids, we're talking adults cannot tell you the 5 liberties of the First Amendment. And so I started teaching in the classrooms, and the news traveled a bit. When I was working as a prosecutor, we had a unique opportunity, 2 unique opportunities that came into play all at the same time. I had the opportunity we had the opportunity to adopt our son, Colton. I don't know if this is too personal, but it's television, so what? You know, I'm not able to have children, so I wanted children, and we had the chance to adopt Colton. Well, excited about being a mom, I wanted to be able to stay home and be with my son. And the second unique opportunity came to work for a law firm that specifically focused on First Amendment law. And I could be a digital employee, which means that the firm worked out of Tampa, which is 2.5 hours from my house. I was able to stay home and be with my son for the first 2 years of his life and still do what I do. And that's where my passion for the Constitution actually really, really started to develop. The study of constitutional law in its application was just a glaring alarm juxtaposition the intent of the founders. And so in that position with the private law firm, I was also doing a bit of traveling across America, representing people who had been arrested for handing out flyers and pamphlets public, protesting, holding rallies and stuff that the local governments didn't know because they didn't understand the Constitution either. And I also instructed schools and school boards and how to maintain the rights of the students, because our students have a right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of expression within the public schools. Even the U.S. Department of Education recognizes that a student in a public school can have Bible studies, they can write about their faith if it's relevant to the subject, they can hand out religious materials to their classmates in between classes. If the school allows them to wear Superman or Pokemon on their t-shirts, they can wear Jesus and religious things on their t-shirts as well. And so we were busy advising the schools on that. When my term with the constitutional law firm ended, I went back to work at the state attorney's office. And in my small rural community, the word got around what I was doing professionally. Our local school board asked me to come and speak to them. They wanted to hold an invocation before school board meetings, but they wanted to make sure that they were compliant with the Florida Constitution and the rights of the people in their freedom of expression. And so we advised them on how to include all religious invocation in a rotation schedule for their invocations and to include everybody in the community, because if you're a public school, you collect taxes from everyone. Your views have to reflect everyone in the community. Otherwise, it's theft. It's tyranny. And so what we did in doing that, I started getting invitations from private civic groups. Come teach us about this. We want to know more. It's 2009, 2010, and there's sort of an awakening of the need of constitutional understanding. And I was working for a state attorney at that time who didn't agree with how I was teaching the Constitution or who I was teaching it to. So he told me that I had to quit teaching, and I was doing this all on my own time. I didn't do anything to interfere with my job. I didn't talk about my caseload. I didn't talk about anybody at work. And he just simply said, you can work for me or you can do this. And after practicing First Amendment law, I realized that that was not the right decision that I had to make. And long story short, here I am. And we, in our faith, we have a saying, what man meant for evil, God meant for good. And I just, as valuable a role I felt I had in the prosecutor's office, because I never wanted to do anything else. I wanted to retire there, and everybody I work with knew that, you know. Even my boss at the time said I was a top-notch prosecutor, and I took my job very seriously. I loved it with the same kind of passion that I do here. As much as I love that, I really believe that what we're doing here reaches so many more people and will have a greater impact on the future as well.
Next call for Kris Ann Hall comes from Hugh in Ashland, Virginia. Hugh, thanks for holding on. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. God bless you, Kris Ann and C-SPAN for having this forum. I want to also say thank you to Kris Ann for her military service and her ongoing important service to this country to keep our freedoms. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran myself. I'd like Kris Ann just to comment on two things briefly. American indigenous people and how the Constitution can help them. Treaties keep being broken, and you saw what happened in Standing Rock related to going to their own reservation. And the other thing would be how she got her ministry started for Haiti. I would like to help with something in that regard, which would be very powerful all the way around. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much for your service as well. You know, what we have to recognize, and I think these are the results of the blurred lines of the operation of our federal government as well. American people generally do not constrain the federal government to its power. And in that, it's doing a lot of things it shouldn't be doing, and not precisely what it should be doing. What we have perhaps forgotten in America is that the Native American communities are sovereign governments. They are not part of the United States. When we created the United States, we allowed the Indian nations to be sovereign nations within our borders. And we did so by treaty. That's how the federal government can make a treaty with an Indian nation, because it's like making a treaty with France, Spain, or Germany. The problem, as you alluded to, is that America is not keeping their treaty. We are violating the contracts with the Native American communities. And a proper understanding of the Constitution and how the federal government is supposed to work is essential to making sure that the federal government is doing what it promises. And when I say federal government, I think we sort of do a disservice by anthropomorphizing the term government. It's your congressman that is failing to uphold the treaties designed with these foreign nations that we call the Indian nations. It is your congressman who is not keeping the promises. It is our presidents over decades who are not keeping these promises. And we as a people must understand that our federal government doesn't have the authority to invade the borders of an Indian nation any more than we have the authority through the federal government to invade Canada or Mexico or France or Germany. And it's the dissolving of these lines of jurisdiction and sovereignty that have become some of the greatest problems that we've had in controlling the federal government. I'm thankful that you asked about our mission to Haiti. If you want to know more about our mission to Haiti, my husband's website is jchall.org. And we are a unique mission team. We're a very, very small mission team through a group called Islander Evangelistic Ministries. And we take sailboats from Florida to Haiti, delivering humanitarian aid, helping in the independent development of the community, supporting the economy locally rather than just bringing in stuff. A lot of problems that they have in Haiti is we have people dumping things into the communities, the U.S. government especially, dumping rice and things into the Haitian community. Haiti used to be one of the largest rice supporters in its region. And now because we dump so much rice into Haiti, the local rice farmers can't compete with free. And so what we try to do is educate and teach the people to be self-sufficient, to be economically and business-minded, and we help them build themselves in an independence from the ground up. We also are Christian missionaries, so we bring the gospel. We help build a church. We just recently built a huge church in a little fishing village called Soulette on an island off the coast of Haiti called Île Vache. And it was such a blessing. This was a very large building, cinder block structure with a tin roof. And it was completed right before Hurricane Matthew hit. And when the hurricane came, these are little villages, mind you, who have no water. The women have to walk 2 miles with a 5-gallon bucket for their water for the day. There's no electricity. Only electricity can be provided by the generators that simply don't exist in many places. And in Hurricane Matthew, we had over 500 people from 4 separate villages and even a couple fishing islands take refuge in that building that we helped build. We are not government funded. We are faith funded. And we just love what we're doing for the Haitian people. And Hugh, if you want to be a part of that, again, go to jchall.org. I hope that you will be as blessed by the Haitian people as we are.
If somebody were interested in having you come and teach a class at their group, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
My website is krisannehall.com, KrisAnnehall.com. And like I said, we teach a lot, and we want you, if you think you might want me to come and teach, you need to contact us now. My friend Janet, who is also my assistant, she does all our scheduling, and she will get you in the schedule as soon as possible. But you know, we also started today, we launched a new forum called Liberty First University, because for 6 years, we've had to turn down invitations to come and teach because it's just me. You know, I'm already maxed out. For the last 6 years, we've spent more time in hotels and airplanes than we do in our own car and home. And it's just a very heavy burden on the family to travel like that. And so we've actually had to turn down teaching opportunities because we can't handle the schedule. So for 6 years, Liberty First University has been a dream for me. And that dream's been reinforced by people who have said to me, Kris-Ann, put something online so that we can learn from you without being here. And libertyfirstuniversity.com is that. This is not just somebody with a camcorder or a cell phone. These are classes worthy of the highest institutions of learning, teaching the Constitution, American history, world history, government, civics, philosophy, the Bill of Rights, all in a manner that is historically accurate, as if those who were writing our Constitution were teaching it themselves. And so we have that available at libertyfirstuniversity.com starting today. So this is a big day for me. C-SPAN and Liberty First University. I'm a bit jittery.
Well, from your book, Liberty First, you write, I, for one, will not send my young son to government schools. It is a sacrifice that our family has decided to make. I prefer my child's mind to be protected more than I need to have cable or the fanciest car or the latest gadget. But if your child does attend government school, you must protect them from brainwashing. It is your duty.
We have, and this is very sad to say, it breaks my heart as an educator. We have an education in America that is now more politically influenced than ever, more ideologically influenced than ever, and we have left behind history and fact, and we teach opinion, we teach political correctness, and we teach what we want our students to think instead of teaching them how to think. And that is a very disturbing thing for me. I have, because of what I teach, I have people sending me the textbook saying, read this section on American history and tell us what you think. It is absolutely mind-boggling what we're teaching our students today about the foundation of America. My daughter went to college in Maryland, and she told me about one of her classes that they spent more time talking about Alexander Hamilton's affairs and or George Washington's affairs and Alexander Hamilton's battle with Burr than they did about the Constitution and who these people are and what they mean. Not only that, we teach in our schools that the women who founded America were non-existent. There was no female influence in the creation of our constitutional republic or our foundational documents. Our history books teach that these women couldn't be involved because they were not respected by the men, they were oppressed, they were treated as irrelevant portions of society and kept in a lower social status. That is so disturbing to me because I know these women now. These women were respected. Mercy Otis Warren, my favorite founding mother, was the first American woman playwright ever. She wrote Shakespearean-style plays that were published and performed in the American colonies with the purpose of poking fun at the British government and encouraging the liberty movement. Mercy Otis Warren is also the first American woman historian. She wrote a 3-volume set called The Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. She said, I have to write this history because I lived it. And she didn't write it in a skew that deified those who fought for independence. She wrote it with truth and honesty and history, so much so that after reading her book, John Adams wrote her a scathing letter because he didn't particularly enjoy the way she portrayed certain events. But she was still so important. Mercy was an important confidant and advisor to many of the men, to Thomas Jefferson, to James Madison, to George Washington. You have Mary Ludwig Hayes, who some Americans might know as Molly Pitcher, who was given a non-commissioned officer status by George Washington for her fight in the Revolution. You have people like Prudence Wright Cummings. These women whose husbands are off fighting created their own local militias to guard their families from the British troops that were invading their homes and violating their families and burning and stealing and looting. And it was her militia group that actually captured 2 Tory infiltrators coming into their community and got some very important classified documents for our battle for liberty. These women were so involved and so respected, and we deny them their honor so that we can I don't know, promulgate a history that's inaccurate so we can support some ideology that is wicked. I just think it's wicked. I mean, America today has, if I can say it this way, has a newfound love for the power of women. I mean, we are wanting to champion women and what they do and who they are. In a society like that, why wouldn't we be championing Mercy Otis Warren, Mary Ludwig Hayes, Penelope Barker, Elizabeth King, Prudence Wright Cummings, Elizabeth Adams, Abigail Adams, Hannah Winthrop, Mary Barthorpe? Why aren't we recognizing these women who believed so much in the equality of all people, that liberty is for all, that they were willing to sacrifice everything that they had so that we could achieve that? I think that it's terrible, and our history books are purposely ignoring them. Our history books are teaching that the Constitution was written by a bunch of elite, rich slave owners whose only purpose in independence was so that they could consolidate power to themselves. Ignoring the men and women of the black men and women, the freed slaves who became a part of our liberty movement so that they could ensure that their children became free. America is not unique because of our houses and our cars and our economic opportunities. America is unique because we were founded upon the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And that's what they believed in. Our history denies the memory of Crispus Attucks, a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines, the first man to give his life in our battle for independence through the Boston Massacre. I mean, it's not like these people are not written about. Like, I'm pulling this out of thin air. There's a whole poem written about the Boston Massacre and a whole stanza written about Crispus Attucks. It says, "Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick car and gray, call it riot or revolution, his hand first clenched at the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart, that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may. Such deaths have been the seed of nations, and such lives should be honored for a." That term for a meant that they believed we would be honoring Crispus Attucks today, forever. But how many people in America know the name of Crispus Attucks, or George Middleton, or Peter Salem, or James Fortnan, or Phyllis Wheatley? These people, Bernardo de Galvez, these people who sacrificed their own personal stations and comforts, a newfound freedom, just so their children could be free. How many Americans know that there was a provision among the states fighting for their independence that if you were a slave, which, by the way, the slaves then were white, black, Irish, Chinese, not just black were slaves, it was everybody. The majority of the slave population in the founding colonies were English white people that the British government didn't want anymore. They sold their own people into slavery to come over to America to help found it. How many know that the states had a provision that said if you were a slave and you want to fight for independence, you're a free man now forever? Our 14th Amendment did not make black people citizens. They were citizens long before the 14th Amendment, and they were free before the Emancipation Proclamation. We had a cultural change that had to happen in the minds and the hearts of the people. And that doesn't come through violence and wars. That comes through teaching liberty and seeing liberty and wanting it for yourself. Who better to fight for liberty than a person who was a slave? But when we deny them our history, we deny the fact that there are some men who gave their only free breath so that you and I could sit here today and talk about it.
You are listening to Kris Ann Hall, author and attorney. She's our in-depth guest this month on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. And the next call is from Imperial, Missouri. Is it Anita?
Hello.
Hi, is this Anita?
Yes, it is.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
Ms. Hall, I live in northern Jefferson County, which is a suburb of the St. Louis region. But my congressional representative in the U.S. House, I vote along with people halfway across the state in the Lake of the Ozarks. The entire United States has been so gerrymandered by the Republican Party that there is no way that the House will ever be anything but Republican as it stands. And I'm really worried about our democracy from the standpoint of gerrymandering and wondering what your thoughts on that are and what you think we can do about it.
Well, I would say that if you look at the big picture throughout history, you will see that you can't really point one finger, you point a finger at one party or another. I personally am very Washingtonian as far as parties, political parties are concerned, which puts me at opposition at times with both the Republican and the Democrat parties. George Washington, our first president under this constitutional republic, gave a farewell address, and he actually warned against political parties. He said that they were a baneful foe to liberty and would be the destruction of a liberty in America. And I think what we have now is the gerrymandering that you describe is being done across America by both parties equally. You are just feeling the influence of one particular party over another. I would tell you, wait a few years and that will probably change as history dictates. But I think that that's the symptom of the problem and not the problem itself. George Washington would tell you that the problem is that we have become a two-party system, and that the American people have lost the proper identity of political parties. I wonder often how many Americans understand that the Democrats and the Republicans are not government agencies. The Democrats and the Republicans are private corporate clubs. That's why you have all of this controversy over the preliminary elections, the primary elections before we get to the general elections. Primary elections are not civic functions. Primary elections are where each private corporate club, with the members of that private corporate club, are to choose who will represent that private corporate club in a general election. The unfortunate reality now is that we have muddled the private corporate club with tax dollars, so it becomes a quasi-government function where the taxpayers are actually paying for an election that is supposed to occur within the body of a private corporate club. And because we have limited ourselves to two private corporate clubs, generally speaking, with every once in a while a third party or an independent creeping in, we now have private corporate clubs that dictate to us elections, laws, politics. It's part of the reason why we think that the President of the United States is the leader of America, because the President of the United States has become less of a representative of the states and more of a leader of that political party. When the political party wants their candidate to win the office of the president, it's because they believe that's now the leader of their political party. And so what we have to do, once again, is ensure that we are getting back to the proper role and placement of the government, the proper application of the Constitution, and that maybe then we can operate as the designers of our Constitution had hoped, George Washington in particular, where we could elect candidates based on their qualifications, on their character, on who they are as an individual, who they've lived their life to be as an individual, as a part of history and knowledge, rather than electing people based on their party affiliation. Our ministry's motto is Liberty First, which is a three-pronged principle: liberty over security, principle over party, and truth over personality. If we could stick to those three principles, it's okay to have a political party, but you got to make sure that principles come first over personalities and parties in order to maintain a just government. And I think if we could just, once again, regain a proper perspective on who political parties are, then the people themselves would have a better opportunity to control what happens in politics.
Barbara's in Huntington Station, New York. Good afternoon, Barbara. Please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Kris Ann, for your work and for the sacrifice that I know this involves for you and your family. And I'm so excited to hear about Liberty University because we've heard you speak here on Long Island, and when we wanted to bring you back, we found we had to wait 2 years on your calendar before you could come back to speak to us. And my question for you today is, our founders put the right to religious freedom first of those 5 freedoms you talked about in the First Amendment. And I'm asking you, how important did they feel religious freedom was to our country? And then how does that coincide, or how does that work with the phrase separation of church and state?
Thank you, Miss Barbara. That is a wonderful question. The First Amendment is first on purpose. It's not by accident. And religious liberty is first within that list on purpose. And the reason that it is first is because it's not just simply a religious right to practice your religion. It is a liberty of conscience, because our founders knew that if any government could dictate to you how you think and who you worship, then you had no liberties at all. One of our founders, who was a delegate in the first states convention, his name's John Witherspoon. He was the president of the New Jersey College. You should look at his history. He taught so many of who would become our America. He said, throughout history, you will never see a nation who has sacrificed the liberty of religion retain any of their other liberties. Because if we can be, the understanding of this principle is if we can be dictated to in our thought process, and the most basic of the fundamental rights is our beliefs, then we will enslave ourselves in our minds to match the dictate of government and enslave ourselves and bind ourselves to chains that we cannot even see. It is the worst form of slavery. It's a self-imposed slavery. Unfortunately today, because we don't teach the history of our Constitution mostly at all, but even when we do accurately, we believe that separation of church and state is something that it simply historically has never been. Since the year 300, and most importantly through our liberty charters that created our Declaration, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, separation of church and state, first codified in the first of those liberty charters called the 1100 Charter of Liberty, was a promise that the government would stay out of the church. Henry I is the king during the authoring of the 1100 Charter of Liberties, so he's given credit for the 1100 Charter of Liberties, said that if the government is influencing your church, you have an evil and oppressive government. And his promise was, we won't be evil and oppressive anymore, so the government and the church will be free from government intrusion. Separation of church and state is not a protection of government, it is a protection of the church. It's a protection of the conscience and the freedom of that conscience of the people. It has always meant that the government has no business in your church. But it's only been since our most recent misunderstanding, and I think that has a lot to do, again, with the way the Supreme Court operates outside of history and application based on personal interpretation and politics, that we've come to believe that separation of church and state means that God has no business in public discussion. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is actually, if you look at that, is a very radical form of belief, because the standard has been separation of church and state says the government stays out of your religion and stays out of your church. And that was necessary to make sure that people remained free and had liberty. And because we don't understand this separation of church and state thing, like I mentioned before, we have public schools and administrators who unconstitutionally, unlawfully limit the speech and conscience of our children in public schools, even beyond the interpretation of the federal government. It is understood, even within the realm of the Supreme Court, that our students do not check their rights just simply because they attend a government school. There is a Student Bill of Rights that's available through the Department of Education, and the Alliance Defending Freedom is another organization who has created a Know Your Rights in the Classroom pamphlet that I use and pass out quite a bit. There's are several groups across America who are focused on religious liberty aspects. We have the Catholics for Freedom of Religion, we have Liberty Council, we have all of these people who are fighting for the proper understanding of religious liberty. And you know, I think that's what I love about what we do. Because I'm not here to be the defender of all rights. I'm an educator, so that you can find whatever piece of liberty means most to you and then you can go to work to defend it.
One of the things we like to do with our authors on Book TV's In-Depth program is ask them to send in what they're reading, some of their influences. Our conversation and your calls will continue in just a minute after we look at Kris Ann Hall's list. Kris Ann Hall, who is St. George Tucker? The author of View of the Constitution of the United States, early 1800s?
St. George Tucker was a delegate in the Constitutional Convention, and he wrote the first treatise on the proper application of the Constitution. It is the primary source of understanding on how the Constitution is supposed to work. We used to teach in the law schools. It is the understanding of the Constitution as a contract. It actually, because he was a delegate, he takes in the discussions and the debates and shows how the discussions and debates formed the Constitution to be what it is. And the interesting thing is he didn't actually write it to be a treatise on the Constitution. Our founders relied on a jurist by the name of Blackstone and his understanding of English common law. And what St. George Tucker wanted to do was to take common law understanding through Blackstone and apply it to this new form of government, this constitutional republic, and how common law is to be applied now under a constitutional republic rather than under a monarchy. And in that, he wrote the premier treatise on the Constitution of the United States. And it's really unfortunate that we don't teach that in the law schools anymore. We have traded it for a treatise written by Joseph Story, which is a more federal-centric and quite often misapplication of the Constitution's intent on the power of government.
From our Facebook page, Joe Eldred. You seem to be suggesting a continuity between the 5 liberty documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but many have argued that the Constitution of 1787 was actually a betrayal of the Revolution of 1776. Do your curses include the work of 19th century political philosopher Lysander Spooner, who wrote Constitution of No Authority, arguing that a social contract can only be valid on those who actually assigned and agreed to it?
When I teach, my teaching is specifically designed to only teach original source documents. So I limit myself to original source documents, which means when I teach from those documents written by the people who lived them, not the interpretations of later authors about what they meant. And so what I like to do is show the students what the founders themselves said, and then they can pick up Spooner or they can pick up somebody else and determine whether they agree with Spooner, not based on my beliefs, but based on the actual events and history itself. Spooner has some very valid points, but once again, he is a later person looking back in hindsight, interpreting what he sees. I think the more, a very valuable role for us as people of this constitutional republic is to be able to look at the history and the writings of the founders themselves, and then to be able to be our own Spooner, to be our own judge and determination, and be able to determine, well, maybe I agree with this or maybe I don't agree with that, but it's not based on my beliefs or somebody else's, but based on the history and fact itself.
Jillian Marciano, Denver, Colorado, email, what is your opinion of the 2014 Bundy standoff in Oregon? Do you interpret the actions of the federal government as a land grab?
Once again, I think that I respect that she's asking for my opinion, but I think what's most important here is how would the designers of our constitutional republic see what our federal government is doing with land in the West? And that's the part that I teach. We have a group of citizens who are exercising their right to petition the government for redress of their grievances. They have a right to peaceably assemble. They have a right to protest. as long as no one is hurt and no property is damaged. But we also have to understand the federal government, once again, has a very limited and defined authority in land ownership. And national parks is not a delegated authority in the Constitution. The only delegated authority in the Constitution, there are two sections that deal with the federal government's authority to own land. And that is Article 1, Section 7, Clause 18. Oh my goodness, here my brain's gonna, I'll run those numbers again. Where it states that the federal government owns property that is purchased from the state with the consent of the state for a very specific purpose: forts, ports, magazines, and needful buildings. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 further defines the Article 1 clause and says, of that property that the federal government owns, this is the authority that they have over their property. There are only two clauses in the Constitution that deal with property ownership in the federal government. And so if it's not a fort, port, magazine, or a needful building to run those three, if it is not a territory held in trust for states, then it is not a lawful possession of property by the federal government. And what we have to understand is that this, as the email writer alluded, is a land grab. It's actually stealing the property and the resources from the state through an unconstitutional authority exercised by the federal government. There's, it's just simply very clear. And the writing of the founders is very clear on these two sections. It is only when we extract the men who wrote those documents and the history from which they wrote it, that we're able to agree errantly that the federal government can own and occupy whatever land it wants. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first set of, was part of the writing of the first set of rules for the first land board for the federal government. And he made it very clear that once a territory becomes a functioning government of a state, the federal government is to have no authority over that land whatsoever, and he said it is to never return to the federal government.
Jeff Hawley, Facebook comment. So, after 100+ years of unconstitutional expansion of the federal government, what can be done now to rein it in? Have we passed the tipping point of no return without a revolution?
You know, that is a great question. That is probably my most asked question everywhere I go. What do we do now? And are we too far gone? And here's the interesting thing. If we had been teaching the Constitution and history the way we were supposed to be teaching for the last 100 years, we'd know exactly what we need to do. We'd also know that we are not too far gone. To be totally honest, we haven't even begun to correct the wrongs. Our framers gave us a plan, a course of action to take when the federal government comes outside of its limited and defined box. Here's the interesting thing. When we teach the history of the Constitution, there is an undeniable truth that history always repeats. There's another undeniable truth. The men who drafted our Constitution relied on that history as wisdom to create a security of the liberty of the people through this new government. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that's the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said, "Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive." Einstein said it the same way, same thing, but a little bit different. He said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that's the definition of insanity. So you learn that history always repeats. You learn that our founders knew this history. They knew that it repeated, and they actually anticipated that maybe with this liberty, because with liberty always comes prosperity, that with the prosperity stemming from liberty, the people might become pacified. They might become lazy in their luxury. They might become complacent and compliant in their comfort. And in that moment, government will take more power, with the permission of the people quite often, than it should have. So they laid out a course of action. And that's what we do in the Sovereign Duty book. We couldn't possibly put all the steps in place right now in this show, but just to sort of as an overview, the education of the people, as Samuel Adams said, we said in the first part of the show, the knowledge and the virtue of the people, their defense of their liberty. The control of the state and local governments, and the use of the state and local governments to control the federal government. One of the greatest gifts the designers of our constitutional republic gave us was the opportunity to self-govern. And one of the greatest condemnations on America today is our refusal to self-govern. We have become so federal-centric because we've lost touch with the principles under which the government's supposed to operate. We've become so federal-centric that we now look to the federal government to solve all our problems when they're actually the source of our problems, and that the solving of our problem must occur state and local. I don't teach my opinions, but if someone were to ask me, in my ideal world, people would be just generally concerned about federal elections. And all of our political efforts, all of our influence, support, and time would go into the election of state and local governments, because that's where all the power exists in the hands of the people. If people would just understand how powerful just the office of the sheriff is in the defense of our liberty, we could change America's course back to a liberty-centric place instead of a federal-centric place in just a matter of years.
And from her book, Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution, Kris Ann Hall writes, a common refrain these days is that we fell asleep. What that means is that our ignorance of the history that brought us our American liberty allowed tyranny to sneak up on us. Next call comes from Peterson in Renton, Washington. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Peterson. I just wanted to ask a question. Do judges have the authority to determine whether an executive order issued by the president can take effect or not?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the best way to answer that is to understand the proper authority of the judge. And by doing that, of the Supreme Court, rather. And to do that, I think we should start off by saying what the Supreme Court does not do. The Supreme Court does not make law. Supreme Court opinions are not the law of the land. And for us to give Supreme Court opinion the authority of law, we are actually violating one of the most fundamental principles of our constitutional republic of separation of power. Lawmaking is reserved to the legislative branch alone so that the laws will reflect the people through equal representation. You did not elect anybody on the Supreme Court, nor can you unelect anybody on the Supreme Court. So they can't make law. What we also need to understand is that the Supreme Court, how Supreme Court opinions work, not how we view them to work, not how we how we interpret them to work, but how law really works. A Supreme Court opinion is only binding on the people in the courtroom, the parties of that case. And it's only binding on the parties of that case as long as it is consistent with the Constitution itself. Under Article 6, Section 2, even the Supreme Court of the United States jurisdiction is limited by the Constitution itself. The question is, can the Supreme Court determine whether an executive order is lawful or not? The answer is yes, but the question becomes, is the Supreme Court's opinion on whether an executive order is lawful or not consistent with the powers delegated within the Constitution? So you would ask yourself, as the Supreme Court is sitting in judgment over this executive authority, First and foremost, is the executive authority exercised consistent with the Constitution? And is the Supreme Court making its opinion based upon the Constitution or based upon their own political ideologies? That's the big difference. Now, the Supreme Court does not nullify an executive order. It determines that its activity is inconsistent with the law. It is then up to Congress to come and be the check and balance on that. It is also up to the president to respect that. If the Supreme Court's opinion is outside the jurisdiction of the Constitution, then it has no authority at all. I wish there was one thing that we could change about the way we speak about the Supreme Court. You quite often hear people say the Supreme Court ruled today. Courts don't issue rulings. Kings issue rulings. Courts issue opinions. And if we understood them in their proper application as opinions that are only binding on the people in the courtroom, and only binding if consistent with the Constitution, then we would have a better perspective of the role and place of the judiciary. Unfortunately, today, we've lost sight of that. Like I said, if you look at the Constitution, the delegation of authority, the Article 1 is the delegation of authority to Congress. Article 2 is about this long, comparatively, for the delegation of authority to the president. And the delegation of authority to the Supreme Court is even less than that of the president himself. We have to understand that by elevating Supreme Court opinions to law and creating a system where the only challenge to a Supreme Court opinion is the Supreme Court itself overturning its past opinions, is a dangerous deviation from the constitutional republic and the creation of an oligarchy of 9 kings and queens.
We have 1 hour left with our guest, Kris Ann Hall, who is the author of several books, her most recent, Sovereign Duty, that we've been talking about today. 202 is the area code in case you want to participate in our conversation. 748-8200 for those of you in the East and Central time zones. 748-8201 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We'll also scroll through our social media addresses, so in case you can't get through on the phone lines, you can contact us via social media. Next call comes from Sean in Kaneohe, Hawaii. Go ahead, Sean.
Aloha from Hawaii, Kris, and I hope you make it here someday. I just have one dilemma. We were illegally overthrown in 1898 by a resolution passed in Congress on June 7th, signed by the president at the time, McKinley. We became a territory of the United States, finally becoming a state, the last state of the Union. Now, Hawaiians are still saying that we were illegally overthrown from the sovereign government we had prior. How do we resolve the matter constitutionally to regain back Hawaiian property, Hawaiian rights, Hawaiian lands from the state that we are now a part of?
Now, Sean, before you hang up, are Native Hawaiians, or Hawaiian descended people, do they have any extra state rights at all in Hawaii?
Yes and no. It's based on blood quantum, but it's up in the air now because of the interbreeding. There's only one island left with pure Hawaiians, and the island is privately owned by a family. So we don't have any outside of Clinton saying sorry when he was president. A formal apology. We have not had any restitution given back to us.
Thank you, sir. Kris Ann Hall, any response for that caller?
I think that one of the most valuable things that Hawaiians right now can recognize is that Hawaii is a sovereign government within the union of the Constitutional Republic. They are no longer a territory of the federal government. They exist now within themselves as a sovereign government. The Constitution was created, or let me put it this way, the Union was created through consent. From its very inception, the only way you became a part of the Union was that the state itself consented to be part of the Union. In the history of our constitutional republic, we invited parts of Canada, what we now know as Canada, to become part of the United States, part of our Union, and they declined. The only way you legally become a part of the Union is through consent. The argument now that I hear is that those Hawaiians did not consent but were conquered. But here's the good news. Because you are a sovereign government, because our union exists in a consensual nature of sovereign governments, not a mandate, not a conquering, but you choose to be here. As a sovereign government, you can choose to no longer be a part of us if you don't want to. A lot of people would refer that to secession, and that's an issue that becomes controversial. How can a state secede? No state has the right to secede. Well, of course a state can secede, because we did not form this union based on mandate. We formed this union on consent. And if we would just simply look on a global perspective, the United States of America is quite like the European Union, a union of sovereign governments coming together for their mutual benefit. Great Britain, being a sovereign government, a former member of the European Union, decided they no longer wanted to be part of the European Union and that it no longer saw the benefit of it, so they left the European Union. They had the right to do that because they were a sovereign government. The union of our states is not created differently than that. As a matter of fact, the European Union is a picture of the union that we created in the union of our states in our constitutional republic. So it has to be a matter of consent, because if you deny a state its liberty to remove its consent, then your state is no longer a state. It is now a colony in a federal kingdom, and we are not a republic, but a kingdom itself.
Kris Ann Hall, let's say somebody is watching this today and goes to your website and wants to invite you to speak to a group, school group, civic group, whatever. When's the first available date?
Oh, I don't know. They'll have to talk to Janet, but I encourage them to actually fill out the speaking request form, because Janet...
But it wouldn't be tomorrow, it wouldn't be next month.
No, it'll probably be 2018, because we're coming towards the end of the year. And remember, in November, our Haiti mission begins. So November and December and the first part of January, we are in country in Haiti. And so you don't have to rush and put something together. We can work in 2018 and build it up and get a good crowd, or get what we need to satisfy the school district to be in there. Or I have a class that I teach that is specifically geared towards law enforcement. It's a 3-hour course on the Constitution. This is actually one of a unique course. My course that I teach law enforcement actually does deal with Supreme Court case law in the realms of First, Second, and Fourth Amendment issues. And so if you have somebody that wants me to teach that course, you can call me or sign up through the form. Janet knows where I'm going to be. And she always tries to block at least a week in a certain location so we can get many, many meetings. And as she's blocking them, there are always open days. So it will be 2018, but it may not be May. It could be, April, because we're already slotted to be in your area for a week.
Next call for Kris Ann Hall comes from James in Tampa. Go ahead, James.
Good afternoon, and Ms. Hall, thank you for being with us today, and thank you to Book TV and C-SPAN. Ms. Hall, I'm a fellow colleague here in Tampa, Florida. I work in real estate law, and we certainly appreciate what you're doing for us. And as I said to the call screener, which I kind of evolved a little bit during your course of action here, I just wanted to get your feedback on the overall control of the healthcare issues that we have witnessed over the past week, and also to get your take on, being that you're a mother, what you think about vaccinations. And it was just on MSN today about the government is cracking down on parents that refuse vaccination. And thank you for taking my call. And P.S., Janet and I have been in touch, and if you ever come to Tampa, Florida, you have got a host ready to host you, Miss Hall.
James, 2 questions. What's your take on the vaccination issue and the health care issue?
Well, I run several radio shows as well, Bank versus UTV, Big Pharma versus UTV. And frankly, it's like everything else that's good. I feel it's been usurped. I feel that the big pharmaceutical companies have really taken advantage of money over health. I don't have a problem with someone that is in a profitable business, say horse and buggy whips. But when you're going to be in the business of human health care or even animal health care, I think you need to put the profitability side aside. And I will interject too that we noticed that Congress and the House voted last week on the FDA's, and I'm going to use my term, quote unquote, air quote, extortion on the FDA, taking kickbacks off of higher end medical equipment, not only being manufactured but being sold, and then taking a tariff off each time a patient is, say, given a CAT scan. You know, I don't want to get all nasty here, but at the end of the day, we have been usurped, we have been extorted, and it's time to give control back to the people, the local municipalities. I have a lot of people that are encouraging me to run for public office. And boy, I go to bed some nights, I say my prayers, Ms. Hall, and I ask God to give me strength. And I do air your shows on my internet TV. I've been in touch with Janet. And in closing on that, I'm on the fence. If I were to be elected to office, I would not sway. But I think we need to get rid of the good old boy network to answer your question,
we got the
sir.
point, James. Thank you. Kris Ann Hall.
Once again, when we're talking about the federal government, we must first ask the question, what is the article, section, and clause that delegates that authority to the federal government to exercise that power? There is no delegation of authority within the Constitution for the federal government to have a Food and Drug Administration. They have no authority to regulate our food, our drugs, or anything that we consume or grow. This is clearly a power reserved to the states. The interesting thing is, when you study the ratification debates and the chief discussion that was happening, pro and con of the Constitution, the greatest objection to forming the Union through the Constitution was that the states would lose their sovereignty, that the federal government would become a kingdom, and the states would be reduced to tributary colonies. It was through the discussion between what we call the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers that we understand, especially in the 40s sections of the Federalist papers, specifically Federalist 45, James Madison is assuring these states, your sovereignty will not be usurped. You will retain your reserved powers. And remember, those reserved powers were all the affairs of the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Madison was ensuring us, assuring these states that the federal government has a very limited and fine power that will never, ever intrude on the domestic affairs of the states in this way. We know that this must have been accepted to be fact. Because had this one point in particular not be accepted as fact, as the driving fact of our constitutional republic, those states opposed to the constitutional republic would have never ratified if they had not the assurance that their powers would be reserved. And so the federal government not having the authority through the Constitution to regulate our food and drugs makes the FDA an unconstitutional, unlawful exercise of power within the jurisdiction of the states. knowing that, the federal government cannot possess a lawful power to mandate vaccinations, cannot possess a lawful power to mandate health care, cannot possess a lawful power to insert a tax on the people to pay for health care. And I think what you mentioned about the pharmaceutical companies is another symptom of our federal government out of control. There's a big argument today against capitalism. Capitalism is not the problem. What we have is corporatism today, which is an unholy marriage of government and corporation. And so what we have is the federal government picking winners and losers through political lobbying and kickbacks and funding of certain products and certain corporations that skew what is really happening in America. So our corporations, for the most part, are not ruled by the free market society because of this unlawful exercise of authority by the federal government. So that's what we need to do. And you're right, we need to return this power back to the states so the people of the states can make sure that their state reflects their principles and their beliefs.
Facebook comment, Dylan Crowder. The comment I am hearing most often from Ms. Hall is, we don't teach, etc., etc. Perhaps the problem is that students or citizens are not interested in learning about the Constitution as much as Ms. Hall. These are abstract concepts and sometimes difficult to teach and motivate students to learn.
The first thing that I would agree with is that these are not abstract concepts. These are axiomatic truths. And you can only believe they're abstract concepts because we're not teaching the history that proves they are truths. They are unavoidable truths. They are things that happen throughout history over and over and over again. These are not unseen consequences. These are exactly what we know. It's like Patrick Henry said, there is a lamp that lights our future, and that's our past. Our past, our history is our greatest teacher. And I would challenge him to say, it is not the duty of the student to want to learn. It's the duty of the teacher to make him hungry to learn. We have been dumbing down our students in classrooms filled with mandates and boredom and remember these dates and remember these names without teaching that these people were alive. I mean, we're talking real live TV drama in the 1600s. We got brothers killing brothers to become king. We've got kings putting people in high towers because they won't pay their taxes. We've got freedom of speech being interrupted, kings outlawing plays and stuff like that. And I think the deficiency is not in the heart of the student, but in the passion of the teacher. I have been teaching this for 6 years. I teach students from 6 to 96 is my oldest student so far. And I teach a 5-hour workshop on Saturdays that goes through the history of the Constitution, goes through the Bill of Rights. I show you where they came from, what they mean, how our founders intended them to be applied, where we've gone off track, and the solutions to making them right. In those 5-hour workshops, which is 5 hours of teaching, 6 hours in a day, I have students of all ages, 6, 7, 8 years old, who sit and listen and learn in that workshop the whole day. They don't take notes, but they draw pictures about what I'm talking about. They draw pictures of me speaking and little pictures of what they learn, and they get excited about that. I have 2 favorite stories that I wrote about on my website. One is about a middle school girl named Whitney, and I don't remember where it was that I was teaching, but I was brought into the public school to teach the history of the Constitution. And Whitney came up to me with her friend, and she's just middle school, so she was all intimidated, and she said, I wanted to thank you for coming and teaching us today. She said, we've had other people come in and teach us, but they don't teach like you do. She said, it's just the way you teach that made me excited about what you were teaching. And what we need is passion back in our classrooms. I had a high school boy, which I think is probably my toughest audience, okay? High school boys. And after teaching the history of the Constitution, he came up to me and he shook my hand. He said, Ms. Hall, I want to thank you for taking your time to come and teaching us today. He said, I want to be in government. He says, I think I might even want to be president one day. But after what you taught me today, I want you to know that I will never let anybody take my liberty again. It's the teacher's job to make the student hungry. This is not just a paycheck. These are not just numbers. These are not just statistics and standardized tests. This is the future of America, the minds that will lead America, and they deserve our utmost passion.
In Liberty First, you take on John Dewey. Who was he?
John Dewey, my goodness. John Dewey is what the education department classifies as the founder of the American education system. But he was a signer of the Marxist manifesto, the Humanist Manifesto. And when you read the statements of Dewey and the plan that he had for American education, you have to question why our teaching system would even uphold him as an authority. He believed that literacy was overrated and that illiterates actually led a more happy life, and that it was more important to teach children to socialize than it was to teach them how to read and write science, arithmetic. And there's actually an article on my website, krisannhall.com, called Stolen Education, Stolen Children, Stolen Future, where I have captured an outline of the creation of our modern school system that begins in 1885. And if we're not familiar with the names of Thorndike, Dewey, Wilhelm Wundt, G. Stanley Hall, and what their philosophies were and how they drive still today our American education system, then we cannot know why our students are failing in literacy today.
And again, from Liberty First, Kris Hall writes, our educational system has become concentration camps of brainwashing and Marxist programming. Our students are not only not taught the Constitution and the principles of liberty, they are constantly indoctrinated that America is the source of all that is evil in the world. America's founding documents are flawed, its founding fathers were bigoted oppressors, its values antiquated, its free market system destructive. Next call for our guest comes from Vernon in Newport News, Virginia. Go ahead, Vernon.
Hello. How you doing, Ms. Hall? And thank you for C-SPAN, all three networks. You definitely do a lot to educate citizens. Ms. Hall, I recognize about state sovereignty. And what I was thinking is that if we recognize state sovereignty justified the segregation laws. State sovereignty justified the secession from the Union, and state sovereignty justified those with heavy melanin content to be property and not human beings. And therefore, none of that would have been corrected if there had not been the use of or the recognition by a higher level, the other part of government being the federal government. And that's why I think state sovereignty, and when I hear states' rights, it scares me, because I've never seen states' rights work for those who are in the minority. But I do agree with you that local and state government is important, and just as important as federal, and if not more important. But I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, how about if we talk about the history of that rather than my opinion? Because what you describe is a common misconception about history in and of itself. If you want to know how the Constitution was a mechanism to end slavery, there's an article on my website, krisannhall.com, titled that, How the Constitution Ended Slavery. And what we need to understand is that state sovereignty did not condone any of those things. State sovereignty did not condone segregation. And by the way, state sovereignty is not what declared men to be property. That was the Supreme Court who declared men to be property in the Dred Scott case. The Supreme Court, using their errant interpretation of the Constitution and misapplication of history, determined in their opinion that men were property, and people picked that up as law. State sovereignty does not enslave. State sovereignty makes free. One aspect of history that we don't teach is that during the Civil War, free states were nullifying federal law to free slaves. Most people don't recognize that the Federal Fugitive Slave Act was a federal law that was being enforced even up into the Civil War. And the free states were telling the federal government, we are a sovereign state. You don't have the authority to dictate to us the classification and identification of our citizens. This person is in our state, and this person is free. And since this person is in our state, we're a sovereign state and is free, we will not recognize your federal law to enslave him. So it is actually the sovereignty of the states that was winning the freedom for all people. Our history likes to teach that specifically black men were not free before the Emancipation Proclamation. That is not true. That is a denial of history of people like James Fortnan and George Middleton. George Middleton formed the African Benevolent Society of 1786. He was not only a free man, he was a citizen who owned a not-for-profit corporation to benefit the families, the widows and the orphans of the black soldiers who fought in our revolution. The idea that the Civil War ended slavery is also errant, because if you look at the laws within the states, the institution of slavery was practically non-existent throughout the Union and only existed in small parts within the individual states. It did not end, Civil War did not end discrimination either. It did not end the views of the people, as you call it, for people with higher contents of melanin. If the Civil War did all of that, then why did Martin Luther King have to march in Alabama? What we need to recognize today, something that the designers of our constitutional republic, black, white, yellow, red, male, female, all recognized, is that the concept of liberty is not something that is won by conquer and war. You do not free through persecution. You cannot plow new fields overnight. In order to incorporate liberty into society, it must be a societal change. And that's what was happening in America, this societal change that actually said, we the people will make a change. It is the constitutional republic that makes America great, because only in a constitutional republic can a minority group have a society-changing voice. And this is just scratching the surface, and I fear in this short period of time I've not done a really good justice to this, but I would encourage you, I would encourage everybody to learn the truth about the end of slavery in America, to learn the truth about how liberty is spread and what our founders did to make sure that we were a place built on the principle that all men are created equal. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Tim's calling in from Haverhill, Massachusetts. Go ahead, Tim.
Hi. Good afternoon, guys. Folks. Sorry. C-SPAN, I want to thank you, by the way, for this opportunity to speak with Ms. Hall. It's really great. I think you scored a real coup here, so to speak. Ms. Hall, I have tried to educate myself and read over the years, and I probably have a very small understanding of what you have of the problems, but I think one of the biggest problems is voter apathy, or apathy of the public in general. and how to get people to understand that their vote does mean something. I think people feel like government and all that it doesn't have a hook into their lives, and so they don't care about voting. Thought about different things, and it's so great to hear you today to help me expand some of that. But one of the things I've wondered about is why, since 1908, we have not changed the number of representatives in the House of in the House of Representatives, and how that has affected the proportion of people whom they represent, and made it difficult for us to have that mechanism to reach people as our representatives through the state. And if we just return to what we had back then, which got changed every 12 years prior or so before that, we would have 4 times as many people in the House of Representatives. And I think we could do that by cutting everybody's salary in 1/4, and that's what we would pay people to go in. And I think that would produce a lot of changes, help us fix the problem not having enough parties, and we would need to make other changes to have this happen. And again, I think maybe a constitutional convention, as we've spoken before, might be possible, might be necessary. So thank you very much. I'd like to hear your portion. And I want to ask one question. What did corporations overcome to become people, as so many other minorities have? Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, we've got the size of the House of Representatives
and the
corporations.
apathy of the people and all that stuff. Well, you know, I believe that the apathy of the people is a symptom of a greater problem, and the greater problem is the lack of education, which results in the people feeling overwhelmed. I don't know about you, but when I see a project or a task that is very big in front of me, I have a terrible habit of procrastinating the beginning of that project because it just seems so overwhelming. You know, if I don't ever try, then I can't fail, right? And I think that's what voting has become in America. We've become so overwhelmed with the out-of-control nature of the federal government by the fact that our congressmen don't follow the Constitution, if they even know what the Constitution means, and they rarely ever listen to the people, and we're convinced that lobbyists and their dollars have more control than the people who actually elect our representatives to office. So the real problem, once again, as Samuel Adams said, is the universal ignorance and debauched manners of the people. He said we will sink underneath our own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. And that part of that sinking is that physical feeling of being overwhelmed because you don't have any control. And if we are able to teach the people the power and the control that they have, then we will be able to break free from the prison of that feeling overwhelmed and actually be able to make a difference. It's interesting that you mentioned, though, about the size of the number of representatives, because in my book, Sovereign Duty, in the chapter on Article 5 conventions, we actually, in a sort of tangent, address that. For the last 50 years, Congress has been researching how an Article 5 convention should work if it should ever be called. And in this research, they call together people they claim to be experts, and they gather reports, and the Congressional Research Survey issues reports and all these other things. Well, one of the points that was brought forward was the fact that we are supposed to be reapportioning the number of House members. There was even a fight in the 1920s to make that happen. Some states brought forward, hey, this is what you have to do. We haven't done this in a long time. We must do that. And I can't recall the name off the top of my head. If you read that chapter in Sovereign Duty, you will be able to see it. But one of the special counsel for Congress at that time used that precedent as a mechanism to say that even if the states want to call a convention, Congress does not need to call a convention. He said, after all, when the states brought forward the necessity of the reapportionment of Congress, and Congress refused, nothing was ever done. His point was that the states, in the power that Congress holds now through perceived authority, The states have no way to actually force Congress to do anything they don't want to do. And because they can't force Congress to even follow the Constitution, they can't force Congress to amend it either. So his point was, who cares if states get together to form a convention? Because Congress, if they don't want to, they don't have to, because the precedent has already been set. This assertion and assumption of power by Congress can only exist because the people have lost touch with the power and the placement of the sovereignty of the states.
Walter Dellinger, former Solicitor General, advised Congress in 1979 that if the states want to trespass any original limitations on the convention, then they have the power to do so. It's right here. What's the cover of Sovereign Duty? What's the big X?
It's the Roman numeral 10 as to represent the 10th Amendment. It is the 10th Amendment that was the codification, the reassertion of the sovereignty of the states. It reads, let me see if I can do this by memory. The powers not delegated to the United States, nor, I always forget that middle clause, nor specifically prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states. So basically what that means is if the power is not specifically delegated within the articles of the Constitution, that power is reserved to the states. So the powers the federal government possess are specifically enumerated, and everything else is reserved to the states. One of the problems that I think we have is we've lost sort of attachment with the definition of words. That word reserved is a very, very powerful word. It actually implies property ownership, a dominion over something to the exclusion of everybody else. And so by reserving power to the states, what we are saying is the states have property dominion over this power to the exclusion of all government, foreign or domestic.
You also talk about the word shall quite a bit and shall not. What does shall mean legally?
You know, my 11-year-old knows what that means. I don't know what's wrong with judges and politicians, you know. It means what it means. It is a specific and ultimate prohibition. What we have, though, is another human nature aspect that comes in. Throughout time, the meanings of words become diluted or even redefined. And that's what we're seeing in the legal world. We are actually seeing in legal documents and in legal dictionaries the idea that the words shall and may are synonymous, which is, I don't know, linguistically ridiculous to assert that. They have very distinct, and have always had very distinct meanings. But that's how society goes sometimes, and it also, again, comes from the lack of proper teaching. I like to give this example when I'm teaching. I want to tell people, I am here to encourage you, right? Well, when we say encourage, you might get the sort of a vision of a cheerleader in your mind, right? But look up the definition of that word, encourage. It means to infuse with courage. Now, as a former biochemist, to infuse means to saturate to the very cellular level. So when I tell you that I am here to encourage you, I am here to saturate you to the very cellular level with the courage to do something. It's a little bit more than a cheerleader, right? That's why we've got to hold tight to standards instead of diluting things into meaningless boxes.
Kris Ann Hall, have you been asked anything by our viewers today that you've never been asked before?
No, sir. But after 6 years, you know, and like I said, we don't just always sort of, as you say, preach to the choir, right? Although the choir does need education in a really great deal. But we are teaching lots of different people, and social media brings also a real varying set of ideals into the public forum. And I think the thing that is attractive about what we teach and the way we teach is that we are so liberty focused. We are not politically tied, we're not party tied, we are so liberty focused that it's attractive to all people and it's inviting. It's not intimidating, because I'm not going to come and scream and yell at you because you don't like my political candidate, right? What we're going to do is we're going to have a logical, historical, and factual discussion. And I'm pretty tolerant on my Facebook page with discussions because I like to have that sort of public forum, but I don't tolerate people who just want to come and throw around political epithets and, you know, that sort of thing. So we do try to make our forums very, very inviting for all people, because liberty, no political party owns liberty. As a matter of fact, it's unfortunate, as Washington said, that the institution of political parties is usually anti-liberty. And that's why Liberty First University is important, because it's going to be able to reach people in the privacy of their own homes. They don't have to be embarrassed to come to a meeting where we're talking about the Constitution. And they can see the universal nature and applicability of the Constitution and liberty itself.
In your view or in your research, what did the Founding Fathers get wrong?
If there was one thing that I could point to that they missed the mark, it was their faith in people to learn lessons of history. They really believed, in that quote that you gave from Jefferson about the amending of the Constitution, they really believed that with prosperity we would have less war, we would have less conflict. The Union would ensure, the way the Constitution was designed, limiting the authority of the executive, would limit the number of wars that we're in, the Union itself would create a peace and prosperity among the states, which would allow the people to spend more time in the development of their understanding of natural law and philosophies and liberties, to give them a greater attachment to liberty and to need less government. And I think it was their faith in that progression that missed the mark most. I think that although they hoped that, they also knew that there were certain aspects of human nature that will always play the same way, which is why they always had a plan B in place. Like we said, the plan to control the federal government when it gets out of control. One of my other favorite founders, his name is Richard Henry Lee. And I agree with many of the historians that he is the writer of a series of anti-federalist papers called the Letters from a Federal Farmer. And in that, he says that history proves that people will suffer an unavoidable, what is the word? How did he go? An unavoidable period of inattentiveness. As we become pacified by prosperity, lazy in luxury, complacent and compliant in our comfort, he said, history dictates that people will suffer an unavoidable interval of inattentiveness. And that's where the education needs to come in.
Guy has been waiting patiently in Falls City, Washington. Guy, you're on with author Kris Hall.
Kris, you alluded to history and the facts. I'm talking about the preamble of the Constitution. Now, the history of America, the robber barons, and the history of labor in this country. Yeah, the preamble says to promote, to ensure domestic tranquility and promote the general welfare. Now, being 80 years old myself, I am familiar with my father's days, and for the 150 years before the Democrats took over, and the New Deal was the only time that was promoted the general welfare. And it's been taken back by the robber barons today, and the latest legislation that I've watched go through Congress in the last 6 months is giving it back to the robber barons, and the promote the general welfare is a thing of the past.
In Your response for that caller, Kris Ann Hall.
I think what we need to, again, understand is the meaning of those terms, ensure domestic tranquility and promote the general welfare, not as we interpret and imply them today, but as they were written to mean. And to promote the domestic tranquility was something that was addressed in the first 10 sections of the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And what they meant by to ensure domestic tranquility, by the formation of the Union, they believed that it would connect the states, these independent sovereign governments together, would connect the states in a relationship that would keep them from warring with each other. Remember, their whole experience is Europe. And these neighboring states constantly warring each other because they didn't have a relationship with each other that encouraged domestic relationships. And so to ensure domestic tranquility, the purpose of the Union in doing that was to create a relationship between the states where they could not only cooperate, but also rely on each other. So ensuring domestic tranquility was not a power of the government to impose regulation on the state. It was to be a naturally occurring thing that happened through the relationship of the Confederation of the States. The general welfare is also a very, very misapplied and misinterpreted phrase in the Constitution itself. General welfare has absolutely nothing to do with handing out money to people from a national level to from a federal level to a local level. General welfare is not what we describe today as welfare programs. The General Welfare Clause was incorporated into the preamble as a reminder of the purpose of the powers delegated to the federal government. And it stems from that problem that we had in the Articles of Confederation, where the federal government was making inequitable treaties. Treaties with foreign governments that benefited one state and the other states had to foot the bill. So they said, look, when the federal government exercises its powers as authored through the articles in the Constitution, it must remember that whenever it makes a treaty, it must take the general welfare of the Union of the States in mind. You cannot make a treaty that benefits one over another. You cannot go to war because of one state over another. You cannot declare peace because of the views of one state ignoring all the others. That general welfare clause was to refer to the general welfare of the states as members of the Union, not as a handout to the people on the individual level. Any welfare that was to take place had to take place on the local level, not from the federal to the local.
Liberty first. There is a to-do list. Keep the proper perspective. Educate beyond the election. ID and educate candidates. Secure and hold halls of power. Purge, recapture GOP. Expand new media. Recapture education of children. Pray for pastoral awakening.
I would say that the purge the GOP would have to apply to all political parties as well. I think the reason that we focused on the GOP because of the GOP's platform is dedicated to the Constitution. I wonder how many members of the GOP have actually read the GOP party platform, especially 2016, which says we are the party of the Constitution, we are the party of state rights, we are the party that believes in limited government. Problem is, we have so many people who call themselves are Republicans who operate contrary to the Constitution, operate contrary to the sovereignty of the states, expand federal power and federal realm, and they are not following their platforms. And I would suggest that the governance of the political system, if we're going to be stuck with this party paradigm, must be that the people are willing to hold the people to the standards of their party and get rid of them if they don't. Any Republican that votes to have federal health care is operating contrary to the political party platform, because federal health care is contrary to the power delegated to the federal government. And so it's these standards that we must uphold, but it's not popular to say that. And I think because we are so strictly liberty, that sort of puts me at odds sometimes with both parties. But what we need to see is that liberty itself is the most valuable possession that we hold as human beings. John Adams said, "Liberty must at all hazards be supported."
In Essential Stories for Junior Patriots, 2nd edition, you have study questions. I thought about making viewers answer one of these ahead of time, but I couldn't answer half of them, so I didn't want to look like a fool.
Can I ask you, can you name the 5 liberties in the First Amendment?
Oh, you know what? I've been trying. Speech, religion, gathering, I'm forgetting. Assembly, right to petition, and
press.
Oh yeah. That one.
You know, the very fun thing about the petition is it's not just the right to petition. It's a right to petition for a redress of grievances. And that is something that we inherited from the Magna Carta. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta says that not only do you have the right to petition, but you have the right to be made whole based on your petition.
Well, here's a study question for our viewers. We've only got a few minutes left in the program, but here's a study question for the viewers to concentrate on. What do you think the anti-federalists were worried about when the Federalists wanted to give the central government more power? So there's one for you to noodle on as we hear from Melinda in Jersey Shore, Pennsylvania. Hi, Melinda.
Hello. All right, Kris Ann Hall, I wanted to ask you 2 questions. The first one is that James Madison says the state power extends to the lives, liberty, and property of the people and the internal order and prosperity of the state. In the words of our founders and the state's compact, what says that there is a limitation to our state and local governments, or do we have to comply with rules that directly conflict with our rights?
What a beautiful question. Here's the thing. The states were reserved this power because that's the home of the people. Remember, it is not up to government to limit itself, ever. And it is the responsibility of the people, as our framers said over and over again, it's the jealousy and the vigilance of the people in the defense of their own rights to limit government itself. Every single government must be limited by natural law. And there's a great book that you can read that helps you understand how that's supposed to work. It's written by a man named Frederick Bastiat, and it's called The Law. Additionally, Thomas Paine's book, The Rights of Man, and James Madison's essay on property, and Samuel Adams' essay on the rights of the American colonists, they all address this aspect of natural law. And to really just sort of answer your question in a nutshell, I want to redirect you to the Declaration of Independence. Because remember, the Declaration of Independence was written to announce and declare the formation of the states by the people. And the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It says, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. So the single purpose for creating our states, the only reason they exist, is not to create economic improvement, not for national security, not for business regulation. It is to secure our rights. That is their primary and sole reason for existence. But remember, our Declaration of Independence continues and says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these means, the securing the rights of the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish. Jefferson will write later in the document that they have a duty to do so. So the reason that the states were reserved this power is because that's where the people had the most control. Think about it. Do you have more control over your state legislator or your federal congressman? I mean, the answer is obvious. Do you have more control over your governor, or do you as an individual have more control over the President of the United States? Well, obviously, you have more control over your local government, so they can have access to more power because you have more power to limit their exercise of that power. And it's when we forget the natural law rights that we possess by the nature of our creation, and that we trade our liberty for security and comfort, that we find ourselves in a place where our states become just as tyrannical as a larger government. And so the states do not have the right to be tyrannical. Their only purpose is to secure the rights of the people.
Email, Newt Reynolds, Santan Valley, Arizona. I'm glad I discovered you on Book TV. You mentioned that at one point in your life you had a spiritual conversation with Christ. Would you mind giving more detail of how this happened, what form it took, etc.?
Oh my goodness. Wow, that's very personal. Like I said in the beginning, I'm a truth seeker. And I always felt an emptiness, so I kept trying to fill that emptiness with something. And a series of events happened in my life that made me very miserable. When I broke my hip in the military, the VA medical system was very, very bad to me. So bad that we had Congress get involved and force them to actually help me and treat me. I was living with chronic pain. I couldn't do laundry. I couldn't do anything in the house without being in bed for 2 days because I had a broken hip, but nobody would help me with it. And I think because of my struggles, because of the chronic pain, because of things going on, we were also struggling in our marriage. The family was having trouble. We were in church, and remember I said that I used to believe that Christians were weak, stupid people, and I was too smart for this. And so I'm struggling internally with this faith thing because I thought it was impossible for me to have faith in something I can't see, feel, and touch. But we had gotten involved. Well, we started attending a church and we were listening, and I was doing my studying, you know, as I do. I'm a very diligent researcher. And the more I read, the more it started to affect me. And I think we hit that point where I realized I can't pull myself up by my bootstraps anymore. I can't fix what's wrong anymore. And I remember being in church that day and just being so absolutely broken. I just said, look, God, if you are who they say you are, then be real to me that way. And I will let you do whatever you need to do to help to fix this. And I will live my life for you because I believe that you did that for me. And I would love to tell you that everything miraculously, you know, angels and choirs and all that kind of thing made everything better immediately. But that's not the walk of a Christian. But it was through our faith and our understanding of the promises of Christ that anything that we go through is for the glory of God and for the betterment of ourselves. And that we can go through this by faith, knowing that there's a bigger plan and a bigger picture, and that all the suffering that we have today is also accompanied by a great amount of joy and peace and happiness. And I never felt that in any other religion. I never felt that peace. I never felt that settlement. I never felt that hope.
And for the past 3 hours, author, attorney, activist, constitutional scholar, Kris Ann Hall has been our guest on Book TV. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.